All right, everybody, I'm showing 10:02 here in Raleigh. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar. This is the July 3rd Thursday web forum for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy and the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So we have both CCAS and the CCASC today, in case that's not enough alphabet soup for you. So for those of you who are used to tuning into the CCAS web forum every month, this is kind of a special edition that we're doing with our partners here. So my name's Hillary Morris. I work on user support and communications for the Southeast and South Atlantic Conservation Blueprints. So on this next slide, here's what to expect from today's webinar. We'll start with some intro and meeting logistics, and then introduce our speaker for the day, who's Dr. Wesley Boone, and he'll present for 40 minutes or so. Then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end before we wrap up with a quick preview of next month's webinar. And then the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center folks are going to share a quick reminder about their upcoming symposium as well. So now I'm going to hand it off to Carrie Furness with the CASC to say a few additional words of welcome and explain some logistics for this morning.
Unmute. Thanks, Hillary, and hello, everyone. Let me add my welcome to this webinar on behalf of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. We're really glad for this opportunity to partner with CCASC and to host this presentation of science funded by the Southeast CASC, but relevant to this combined group of interested users. So glad to be a part of this. So I'm going to quickly just cover some of the features of the Zoom interface that we're using for today's webinar, recognizing that all of us are probably pretty familiar with Zoom, but that some folks do use different technologies. So just a few things to point out. Controls on the bottom left of your screen allow you to mute and unmute your audio. We will keep all lines muted, and we also ask that you keep your video off so we can reduce distractions for our presenter. In the middle of the bottom bar, you can access the chat window and encourage you to, during the course of the presentation, to pop any questions you have in there, and then we'll submit them to Wes at the end of his presentation during the Q&A session. And then lastly, and then in the reaction bar, you can see there's a way to raise your hand. So when we get to the Q&A, we'll ask you to raise your hand and then unmute to ask your question if you prefer that. And then lastly, we are recording the webinar. You probably got that notice as you came in, and you can access the recording afterwards in a couple of places that we'll mention at the end too, but Hillary will post it on her CCASC website, and we will also post it in several places on the CCASC website. So, yes, I'm going to go ahead now and launch a short poll just to get a bit of information about who's with us today. And help us know how to continue to get the word out about some of these seminars and other events. So just give you, half a minute or so to fill it out, and we'll share the results. And I think this also might help Wes know who's on the line with us and how he might, maybe, I guess, address some of the issues that you might know that some of you all might have in relation to this science. So, all right. Yeah, this looks like a great set of folks. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this and share the results. And looks like we've got a nice representation of federal, state, and tribal, university, and NGOs. So I'm glad to see that breadth and expect that that's going to give us some good opportunity for discussion at the end. And thank you all for reading our newsletters and for sharing the word. So I'll stop that. And then we'll go ahead and turn to our presentation. So if you want to pop that next one up real quickly, Brittany, and then we'll shift screen sharing to Wes. So this is the title of our presentation. And then while we switch screen sharing, Wes, if you want to go ahead and get started, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Wes Boone to you today. Wes is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources here at NC State University. And he's funded for this work by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. As a disturbance ecologist, his goal is to provide insights that better enable the conservation and management of natural resources while accounting and caring for stakeholder interests. He strives to reach this goal by conducting applied research with an interdisciplinary approach, which I think you'll see a bit about today, while he's discussing some work on a CCASC-supported project assessing the climate vulnerability of wild turkeys across the southeastern U.S. So go ahead and take it away, Wes.
Hi, everyone. I'm giving a message saying we may not be in it. We'll check here in a second to make sure that it tracks slides when I change it. But Carrie, thank you for the introduction. I'd like to thank CCASC first for inviting me to talk today. Second, all, of course, for funding us and funding this research. With that, I'd also like to go ahead and, if it will allow me,
we're seeing not in presenter mode, so I think we may need to switch again.
Stop share, reshare.
Yeah.
How about now?
Beautiful.
Perfect. There we go. There's always going to be a hiccup. So with that, I'd also like to thank all of our collaborators on this project. So my boss, who I most frequently answer directly to, is Krishna Pacifica. He's been a great support and a great mentor. I also work with Christopher Mormon here at NC State, who is always there when they need revisions or anything like that, and great encouragement. Adam Tarango is our USGS CCASC climate science guru. Anytime I can't find data, he can find it and he can help me access it. And then all of our turkey data that we'll be looking at here, or most of our turkey data, actually comes from grad projects that were administered by Dr. Collier and Dr. Chamberlain at LSU and UGA. And so I'd like to thank them for joining us in this collaboration and allowing us to use that data, those data. There we go. All right, so we'll start this talk with most climate science talk start, which is looking at carbon concentrations. So this graph from 2016 looks at different potential emission scenarios and how that influences carbon concentrations within the atmosphere. It's important to note that I looked up what June was for last year, and it's actually above what, or not last year, this year, just last month. And we're already above what even the worst of these scenarios looks like, most aggressive of them. However, if we follow Paris Climate Accord and other international agreements, where we're aiming for is about where this blue line is. That's a little bit vague in that, you know, what does 420 parts per million actually mean? And so we'll get into that now. First of all, it influences, of course, temperature. Many people know climate change is global warming because that is one of the most prolific effects of it. So those different scenarios, the one that we're aiming for is this line here, going through 2065, 2100, and 2020 or 2200. Regardless of which scenario we end up with, we are looking at a warmer future. The joke is, you know, this year's hot, but it's the coldest year we'll ever have again. So how does that influence wildlife? How does that influence other global processes? Well, warmer air, for one, holds more moisture, but it also does a great job of drying out other areas. And so as we move into the future, what we're also going to see is shifts in rainfall distribution, and not just rainfall distribution. Here in the Southeast, we're only looking to see a very, you know, marginal increase in net rainfall. However, when it does rain, what we expect is for it to be more severe rainstorms. And so longer breaks between rainstorms, but when they come, more torrential downpours. Now, warmer temperatures and more rainfall, logically, many people would deduce that, well, that's going to influence vegetation and things like spring greenup. When does spring actually happen? One logical deduction from that is, you know, that's going to happen earlier in the year as things get warmer. However, that's not necessarily truly the case. In this map, what we see is this year, how did spring greenup change compared to normal? And we find that, you know, the Northeast, yes, it happened earlier. However, down here throughout most of the Southeast, it actually happened up to 20 days later than historic norms. And the problem, or the cause of that, is during the winter, we didn't have as many cold days. So leaves and buds didn't have as long to get those chilling effects that they need for buds to break. And so the end result is it has to get a lot warmer later into the season before those buds can actually break, since they didn't get that senescent period. So all these add up to influence wildlife populations. Green up in particular is something that many wildlife populations track. In this graph, what we're looking at is seasonality, and then influence of seasonality on both the dotted line is nutrient value of vegetation, and the solid line is net biomass. And so we see that nutrient value peaks before biomass, so in that initial green flush. And then what each of these arrows shows is when did different migratory wildlife species show up to eat that vegetation. And we see that they're tracking pretty efficiently where that green up is. And so what this is called is the green wave hypothesis. And those animals are referred to as surfing the green wave. However, while that was the historic norm, within the last 10 to 15 years, we find that some of these animals aren't able to keep up with that green wave. They can't migrate fast enough to keep up with it. And so they are in, as a product, not getting as much nutrients. And since for many of these species, that's when they are having offspring, those offspring aren't getting the nutrients they need, and they're having reduced recruitment as a result. We see similar patterns with birds. When green up moves earlier, which is the bottom side of this, we also have birds arriving, migratory birds arriving earlier, and they're tracking it pretty well. However, what we just showed a little bit ago, where here in the southeast, green up actually sometimes is occurring later, you see that with birds, they're not so good at tracking when green up moves later. And the end result of that is, again, reduced recruitment, reduced fitness of those species. So how does wildlife track phenology? Overall, it's a fairly well-studied topic, so long as we stick to migratory species or endangered species. However, the results are pretty inconsistent. Some species are benefiting from this, others it's harming, and so we need more of a species-specific approach to this question. That way, there's not a broad generalizable, like all birds it's bad, all ungulates it's good. So we need more research. And in general, this lack of research is most notable when we're looking at non-migratory bird species, game species, and species with declining populations, which, while that could describe a number of species, what it particularly describes, and what we're here to talk about today, are eastern wild turkeys. So I think most people in this talk are familiar with eastern wild turkeys, and we know that these days we see them quite abundantly. However, that is a result of more than half a century of restoration action. So early in the 1900s, their populations crashed. There was a result of overharvesting and numerous other variables. However, through active management and many, many long hours by many, many people, these populations have come back, and they've been restored throughout much of their range in the eastern United States, and even been extended into some areas where they aren't necessarily native, but are now have been added for hunting opportunities. And the result of this is that large geographic range means that there are hunting opportunities throughout much of the United States, and the result is they are the second most hunted species in the country. And if you're the second most hunted species in the country, you also have a large economic contribution. The last study that I can find that quantifies how much that contribution is was from 2003. And if we move that to today's dollars, we're looking at an annual contribution of about $2.9 billion. However, in the 20 years since then, turkey hunting has become yet more popular. And so that would be probably a pretty conservative estimate at $2.9 billion. However, turkey populations also seem to be declining over the last 10 to 15, 20 years throughout much of the southeastern US. And recent trends indicate that those declines may be extending on to areas beyond just the southeast, into the northeast and into the Midwest. So what is the cause of these declines? Likely many different things, and there's ongoing research into that. First of all, is it that this is the only game bird that we hunt during its breeding season? So there's research into that. Are we over-harvesting it? Do we need to change our bag limits? Looking there, is it a result of reductions in prescribed fire, which prescribed fire results in green ups after it, that also provides food and forage for turkey poults, baby turkeys? So a number of things there with ongoing projects. However, what's not really been looked at so far is long-term weather trends. And this is likely because that data just hasn't really existed. In a master's or a PhD project, you get 2 to 3 seasons, and so you don't really get a long-term trend. And that's the power in what we have here, is that by collaborating with people who have had numerous grad students doing ongoing research, we have 8 years of data that we can look at trends over time and begin to account for how weather is influencing them, and then infer how climate change will influence them. So for this research and what we'll talk about today, our objectives were first to look at how climate may influence nest initiation date. So when are they actually laying those eggs and when are they beginning to incubate those eggs? And then 2, after that, how does weather influence their nest survival? And so we're going to look at nest initiation date. The first thing we have to do is dispel the rumor that turkeys have offspring at the same time every single year. What we actually see is averaged across all of our different sites, up to 2 months in variation and when this is happening, with the means averaging over about 3 different weeks. But even within individual locations, we'll see up to a month in variation from one year to the next. And so there is a decent amount of variation there in when birds are actually laying eggs. So using that data we talked about that's been collected over from 2014 through 2021, we have 717 nests that were tracked during that period throughout the southeastern US. That's really the power of this analysis, is we have a large geographic range, and we also have a large sample size. Spread over 8 years is enough to begin to infer whether, of course, climate happens over much larger spans, but we can begin to infer from 8 years of data. And I'd like to point out that the nests that we're using are only the first nest of the season. If we're interested in what's causing the initiation of the season, we wouldn't want to look at, say, a bird that had a 4th nest at that 4th nest that doesn't come until July. So we're only using those first nests. So looking at that green wave hypothesis, we need data on when the green wave is occurring at each of those 717 nests, and so that we can figure out, is the turkey surfing that green wave? To do that, we use the remotely sensed data with 250 meter accuracy, so we can really zoom in right on where that nest is on the ground and look at when did spring green up occur. So the metric we're looking at is when does greenness begin to ramp up for the season. And then we can compare that to when nests were actually laid to figure out if they are tracking each other. And we have that all the way through 2020. But we also want to know about temperature and precipitation. In particular, we're looking at what is the high temperature, what is the low temperature, and then what is the temperature variance for these areas. We're also looking at what's the total rain precipitation. And then down here on the bottom, how do we group that? Well, we want to pull those different metrics for January, February, and March. So the 3 months that precede nesting and or the beginning of nesting season, and then the 30 days that immediately precede nesting. The resolution of this data is a little bit larger, and so this is 4 kilometer resolution, still pretty great resolution. And we have this down to daily temporal resolution. So we can have this for every single day during one of those periods, and then we average across it. For this, we used our modeling approach was Cox's proportional hazard models. Which are also known as time to event models. And so what these look at is from January 1st until the date of the actual nesting event. So for our nesting event, we're calling this incubation. When does the hen actually start sitting on the nest? What influences when that happens? What makes it happen earlier and what makes it happen later, or what is associated with earlier or later nesting? So we first put variables together and we tested combinations of up to 4 variables. We selected 4 variables because when we went above that with our data, we started having convergence issues. So 4 was the max that we could really look at. So we have anywhere from 1 to 4 variables in any model. We tested all possible combinations of those, excluding ones that had excessive correlation. So if they had a variance inflation factor of above 0.7, we didn't include those in the same model. And then we ranked models by AICC and present the results of those model averaged results. And then we did this for the full data set, so all 717 nests, and then we did it also for a subset of those nests, the core 70%. And the reason why we did that core 70% is here we have a graph where the x-axis is the join date, the y-axis is the fate of the nest. And so every dot is either here at the bottom a failed nest, or here at the top a successful nest, so one that hatched. And we set a line to it, just a free-form line. What we see is here at the beginning, we have a lot of failures, and here at the end, we have a lot of failed nests. And so if we're trying to manage for successful nests, what really matters is this core area. This is also the core area is when hunting is taking place and when most management of these birds is taking place. So that core 70% is trying to get at that area where we have the most recruitment. What influences the timing of that? Then we also wanted to include a few random effects. And so random effects are simply included to account for sampling bias, any kind of error that could result in, that could influence the results of our data in ways that hide the patterns we're actually looking for. And so first we tested individual bird ID. And so if we had a bird that we caught in year 1, and then we caught it in 2 and 3, we wanted to account for that's the same bird, because we know within turkeys that some hens are just really good at raising babies. They year after year have successful nests, whereas others year after year have zero success. So we wanted to account for that. But we found that really within our data set, we didn't have many of those. And so that wasn't much of an issue. We also wanted to account for whether or not there was a year effect, maybe something beyond what we sampled, our temperature and precipitation variables and green up. And we found that year really wasn't the factor we were looking for either. However, study area did have an influence on it. And so we grouped them into different study areas based on their proximity to one another. And we found that from east to west, there was a lot of variation in when they were occurring. And so we did account for that. So first off, that green wave hypothesis, the idea that maybe they're tracking when green up occurs, that green up occurs and right around that time is when they're having offspring. We didn't find that at all. They are pretty consistently having offspring after green up has occurred. So they're not showing up before that resource pulse, but they're showing up after, and it doesn't seem to track year after year. There's a lot of just random chance in where they land there. However, when we look at the full data set, and so all of our locations, we find that total precipitation in the 30 days prior to it, if we have a lot of precipitation in the 30 days before nesting, we have less nests that are occurring during that time period. However, if we have very little droughty conditions, then we have a pulse of nesting. And so that means that we have nesting but occurring earlier in dry springs, and we have nesting that ramps up quicker. And so it's not just that it occurs earlier, it's also that there are more happening at the same time. And we also find that for the full data set, if we have a wet January, we have an earlier nest initiation period. And so wet January has resulted in earlier nesting. And again, also at that earlier time, we have more nests on the ground each individual day. When we look at the 70% data set, that core area where we're really trying to manage for, what we find is that, first of all, variance in temperature. And so I try to use these graphs to show, is it the difference between the high and low fairly consistent, or is the difference between the high and the low very sporadic and variable? If we have a lot of variance, they nest later. However, if February's got pretty consistent temperatures, then we have earlier nesting. And so variance, which we expect variance to increase under climate change scenarios, looks like it pushes nesting potentially later if it's influencing variance within February. And then what we also found was that the maximum temperature in February influenced when nests are being laid. And so warmer Februarys did correlate with earlier nesting in our core data set. This is important because moving forward, we would expect Februarys to get warmer, and so we would expect nesting to move earlier into the year. This has implications both for reproduction, but also for hunting. People want to hunt turkeys when the toms are out there calling. That is the big attraction as to why we hunt them during their nesting season. And so if they're moving earlier, it may mean that we need to think about adjusting hunting seasons at some point in the future to track that. All right, so we have birds on the ground, we have nests being laid, but how does this actually influence survival? Tracking it earlier or later doesn't really mean much if they're still surviving or if they're not surviving. So let's look at how weather influences this. So did these eggs actually hatch? To do this, we used the same data set. We did have to trim it down by 2, remove 2 nests that we didn't have an end date for. Whatever happened, we knew the eggs got laid, but no one walked in to check exactly what day they failed on. And so we had to trim slightly. But again, we're using the same large data set across the Southeast in 2014 through 2021. And for this time, we're really not interested in the maximum temperature. These are the earliest nest of the year. We know that breeding continues for months beyond this. And so high temperatures probably aren't resulting in nest failure. So we didn't look at high temperatures. Plus, we had some issues with correlation between highs and lows. And so we chose just to stick with what was the low temperature and the variance of the low temperature for these different periods. Again, we also looked at precipitation, summarized during them, and an interaction between precipitation and temperature, because, you know, maybe cold weather is annoying, but it doesn't cause mortality, or maybe precipitation is annoying, but doesn't cause mortality. But if you're cold and you're wet, mortality, or you just abandon your nest. It doesn't have to be a mortality event. But we wanted to see whether or not there was an interaction there. And then I specified 48-hour total precipitation. That is just for this during period. And so what was the weather when the nest was actually on the ground? And we used 48 hours before because we wanted to know, did rainfall right at the end of the nest result in a failed nest versus a successful nest? And so moving forward with having heavier rain events, is that going to be problematic for turkey reproduction? And we also looked at absolute minimum temperature during the nesting period, with the thought that maybe a late season cold burst, a late freeze could result in mortality or nest abandonment. For this, we also wanted to include a few variables that aren't directly climate related. However, if we didn't include them, people would yell at me that it's visual obstruction. It's one of these other things. And so one of those is, as I said, visual obstruction, which is a metric of how dense is the vegetation. Frequently, this is included because the theory is areas with low visual obstruction, predators are more likely to detect the nest and either raid the nest or at least run the hen off of the nest. So we looked at, does visual and obstruction influence nest survival? We looked at year, because we had some years where recruitment was absolutely zero, and other years where it was high. And so we included the year in the model. And then we included the Julian start date. So throughout the year, is it, does nest success peak at some point, or does it, decline or ramp up throughout the season? And for this, we use generalized linear mixed models. So long name, but in short, it's just a linear model that allows us to model binary outcomes, so success or failure, 0 or 1. And it allows us to account for those random effects. So did the site where we sampled influence the outcome? Were they auto-correlated? And so it allows us to account for that. Long name, simple, relatively simple concept. For this, we ran 5 semi-global models. And so those were for different time periods. One semi-global was for January, one for February, one for March, one for the 30 days prior to nesting, and one for during nesting, so during incubation up until either the nest failed or succeeded. And the thought there was that we wanted to determine, is it what happens long before the nesting, right before the nesting, or during the nesting that is most important? Again, we excluded variables that were excessively correlated. We didn't have any issue with that in these because of how we set those semi-global models. And then we ranked those 5 models by AICC so that we could determine which one best accounted for the variation that we observed. And what we found, rather intuitively, is that the best model far and above was the model for nesting or during nesting, that best accounted for which nest did and didn't survive. Now within it, once we model average the cross competing models, we have 14 competing models. What we found is that minimum temperature was the best predictor of nest survival. And so if you have really low minimum temperatures, then you had really low nest survival. Whereas as it got warmer, we had higher rates of nest survival. So infer from this that, warmer temperatures could be net benefit to turkey reproduction if these trends track. What we also found, which at first was a little bit counterintuitive, is as we increase variance during the nesting period, temperature variance, we also increase survival. Like I said, initially that was a little bit counterintuitive. However, when I looked at weather data, what I found is that in the winter, when it's cold, you don't have as much variance, as much difference between the lows and the highs. But as we get into spring and warmer weather, you have a lot more variance. And so what this is really picking up on is once we get into spring weather patterns, warmer temperatures should have a lot more variance. So that was pretty logical once I sat down and actually thought about it, or thought about it more deeply. Next, and this is pretty well established in the literature, nest success declines throughout the season. Those early nests have the best chance of succeeding. Later nests have a greatly reduced chance of succeeding. And part of that, part of the going theory there is that it's not just weather, but it's also once you have nests on the ground, predators cue in on it and they start looking for them. So those early ones get the advantage of they aren't being looked for yet, whereas later ones, predators know they're there and start harassing hens of abandoned nests or directly predating upon nests, although generally it's abandonment, not direct predation. So from this, we know those early nests are the most successful ones. So what happens early in the season and how weather influences early in the season is very important. And what we also have here is for the 48 hours prior to nest success or failure, rainfall is very important. So those severe rain events, as we go across the X, we're increasing rainfall and then influencing survival. And so each of these measurements, to put it into a American version, that's about 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches, and 4 inches. And so if you get 4 inches of rainfall in the 2 days prior to the end of nesting, there's a good chance that nest failed. That I think makes a lot of sense. And also is a bit problematic in the future where we expect rain events to be more severe. So what are our big takeaways from this? What are our conclusions? First of all, warmer springs are resulting in earlier nesting and increase in nest survival. That's something that we can expect to move forward with, where as things get warmer, nesting generally, we can expect positive feedback there. But it's not that simple in and of itself. Temperature variance, if it occurs before the nesting, was detrimental. And so climate change also increases variance detrimental. However, if it happens during nesting, we found that it was positive. So as I said here, it's complicated as to what the final takeaway there is, other than if we have variance preceding it, we could have more problems moving forward. And then finally, extreme rain events decrease survival. We expect more extreme rain events under climate change scenarios, and so that would result in decreased survival. So when we put all of this together, it's the big question is it going to help or hurt turkey populations and their reproduction? And I think generally speaking, we could see increased survival. However, it also becomes harder to predict, because while temperatures are pretty easy to predict moving forward, rainfall is not. And so you could have good years and bad years that just stochastically occur. And so knowing whether or not you're going to have a good year or a bad year isn't something that we can really predict, because we can't predict are you going to have a wet or a dry season. We can to some extent, but not effectively. And so with that, what are our next steps? So we took it from when is nesting occurring, and then to when are they hatching. The next step is to say, all right, they've hatched, that 170 something nests that have hatched, do they move on to fledge? And so that next 30 days, do they survive that next 30 days to become, to get to a stage where they're pretty, like if they make it to 30 days out, there's a good chance that they will make it to adulthood. And so that is our next step, is to see, does climate influence these little hatchlings, these poults? And then also, once we wrap up that part of it, we'll go in and look at how is climate influencing habitat selection. And so there's a good deal of research that looks at where turkeys are in the landscape during hunting season, but there's not a lot of research that tracks them all the way through the year. And some recent research out of the Gould subspecies found that it's highly variable, that snapshot we have of the hunting season isn't accurate for where they're using early spring and late winter. And so we want to add that in. That way we can manage landscapes and make sure that we're not just protecting where they are when they're hunted, but we need to protect where they're going to be the rest of the year, both for current climate conditions and future climate conditions. And with that, I will open the floor for questions.
Thanks so much, Wes. That was such a fascinating talk. Yeah, we definitely have some time for questions, so feel free to jump in. You can use the chat. You can just pop yourself off mute and ask verbally, whatever you prefer. A question in the chat that I'll just read out for the recording. Did you look at rain events prior to 48 hours before hatch fail? If so, did those affect survival?
Jacob, that's a great question. So we did, and then it resulted in some pretty wild, we found that more rain was positively associated with survival, which is counterintuitive. And then it turned out that it's actually a design error. And so a successful nest is on the ground for 30 plus days. And so you have cumulative rainfall for 30 plus days if we did it throughout the entire nesting period. Whereas many nests fail within the first 24 to 48 hours. They just don't have a chance for as much rain to fall cumulatively. And so for us to make sure that the sample size there, we're not comparing a cumulative of 30 to 35 days to 2 days. That's why we went with that 48-hour blip before it. That way it's a consistent metric all the way through it. So that was how we solved that problem. We also, that 30-day period prior to it was trying to see whether or not standardize it as well. So we did look at it. That was our solution. I'm open to ideas if there's possibly a better, another way to look at that. But that was our solution. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you. Good question. Anybody else? Carrie, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks. I'll just throw it into the audio. So, Wes, what's your thinking about the best way and timing, et cetera, for this information to get to managers to allow them to do some adaptive management around either habitat or, harvest, strategies, et cetera, just sort of how this information can best get into the hands of the people who can use it in a timely way?
That's an excellent question. I think the first step is for us to obviously publish it out, and then moving forward, look at a adaptive management and start including in some adaptive management models. What we'll have when we publish it as well is an overall, how much do we expect this to change, like a decadal scale? How many days are we talking about it regressing each decade? And so let's say every decade we expect it to back up 3 years. That's something that they can begin to think about when they're setting hunting seasons, because hunting seasons aren't something that we can dynamically change every year. We can't say, all right, next year's supposed to be a warm spring, and so let's back it up, and then a year later it's supposed to be a cold spring, so let's push it further, like later. You can't change hunting seasons year by year like that. They need to be pretty consistent, otherwise you have an issue with relaying that information to hunters. So if we know that's expected to change by, say, 3 years or 3 days per decade, then we can begin to adjust hunting seasons based on that, and continue to model it forward. See the trends that we found, do they hold? But they're also only a small portion of this. Again, we're talking about a few days variance that we can account for in our models, whereas we're already seeing, a month of variance. So it's maybe 10% of total variance that we can account for just based on climate. There's also just some stochastic random chance going in there, and some other things that we haven't clued into with ours.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question? Question from Philip in the chat: from a land management perspective, how would you recommend adapting landscape level prescribed burn scheduling and implementation when possible?
Very good question. And so this isn't something that we expressly looked at. However, there's recent research that shows that poult survival largely depends, once we actually have poults that hatched, on whether or not they can find food resources. And a lot of what they're eating at that age is insects. Areas that are unburned don't have a lot of insects, so you need areas that have been recently burned, within the last year and a half, to have those high abundances of the insects that they're going to eat. That said, you also need a mosaic approach so that there are areas being burned in any given year, but there are also areas that will burn next year, then the next year. So I think it's complicated and highly, as all things with wildlife are. I think it can be a little bit complicated. However, we do see that being successfully applied across lots of public management areas where they are doing this mosaic approach of, relatively smaller burns, a few hundred to 1,000 acres, rather than, say, torching 5,000 acres once every 3 years. Thank you.
No, I'll just jump in there too with that. I appreciate your insight. Just the challenge of the scenario with a warm, dry spring is perfect scenario for burning, but it sounds like it's perfect for nesting. And just that offset of, if we recreate the habitat in year A, does it give them poult survival in year B, and just managing that. We've definitely been looking at the mosaic more so than ever before, and trying to let fire go where fire naturally wants to go, for sure, and trying to strategically put it on the landscape. But I appreciate your insight.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you see it every year in the chats of no one wants to see a picture of a burned over nest. But if that nest was going to hatch and then the poults were going to ultimately die anyway because they didn't have food, is it better to burn it and have food and successful poults the next year? And that's a hard one to say, because you don't see the successful poults in year 2, but you do see the burned over nest in year 1, which is a bit gut wrenching. Thank you. Jennifer asks, is there data that suggests that population declines are related to poult survival versus losses at other ages? I don't think we have data that tells us exactly, that really draws that connection to what the declines expressly are, but we do know that poult survival is a pretty integral component. And so if we were to look at 2020, for example, that year we had a number of nests that hatched. However, in North Carolina, not a single one of those nests went on to, all the fledglings died, or all the poults died. We didn't have a single successful nest through the spring. It's a bit of a sieve. They hatch, they move around the landscape, and I refer to them as little chicken nuggets. As they're running around, every predator on the landscape wants to eat them, and they're pretty good at finding them. And so figuring out how to get them through that critical period, that first month of life, is a great way to increase recruitment overall. If we can get them to 30 days, 35 days, they can do the rest on their own.
Gotcha, that's interesting. still have a little bit more time, so feel free to jump in. Is anybody looking at mesocarnivore populations and climate change?
Yes. There's a recent paper that came out looking at mesocarnivores across the Southeast and what their populations are doing in response to both vegetation change and to things like precipitation. And they had, I mean, it depends on the species as to what they found. I'm trying to think of who led that paper. Professor at Mississippi State, Dana Morin, wrote that paper. And so that's the most recent thing that I've seen on that. Beyond that, a lot of what's influencing mesocarnivore populations is urbanization and how we manage the landscape. So do we have, basically, are we providing lots of resources that pump up their populations, or are we managing in ways that help to keep them at naturally low levels? Because we know things like raccoons are excellent nest predators, and raccoons are highly associated with people. We put out food for birds, or maybe it's our trash. All these other resources result in high populations of raccoons, and that results in nest failures. So things like that need to be considered, especially as we don't generally think of turkeys as an urban species, but if you go into downtown Asheville, there's a good chance that you will see turkeys. There's a number of communities where they're becoming more of a suburban urban species. And so thinking about how that influences them is important management moving forward. Now, those aren't really hunted populations. You're not pulling out a shotgun in downtown Asheville, but it doesn't mean that they can't be source populations for areas around it.
That's where I grew up. My parents still live there. I feel like I need to call home and ask if they've seen any wild marauding turkeys downtown.
We were there a month ago for a turkey conference, and for the 12th annual or national symposium on wild turkeys. And the first night, a bunch of people found a flock of turkeys in downtown Asheville, which is just kind of funny and ironic.
That is funny. Any questions for Wes?
If anyone has questions and they don't want to ask here, I have my contact information in the bottom right. Feel free to send me an email. Happy to reply. And again, thank you all for your time. I know you're busy, so I appreciate you giving me this 45, 50-minute block.
We appreciate you sharing your research. All right, I'm going to pause for 10 more seconds just to see if somebody wants to jump in, and then we'll move on.
If you want to stop your screen sharing, Wes, while we wait for that last question, and we'll let the next slide come up. Thanks.
All right, not hearing any questions, but as Wes said, you can contact him after, or we'll pause one more time before we log off today. If we could go to the next slide, I just want to share a brief preview of next month's Third Thursday Web Forum. We would love to see you all back in August. We're going to be hearing from Amy Gutierrez with the Georgia chapter of the Nature Conservancy, along with Alex Lamley, who is a user support specialist for the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, one of my colleagues. So as many of you all probably know, renewable energy development is rapidly expanding across the Southeast, and that does have some benefits, green jobs, economic growth, but there is increasing concern about the potential for large-scale solar to cause environmental degradation and negatively impact sensitive species. So TNC in Georgia worked with a whole bunch of different partners to develop this Georgia Low Impact Solar Siting Tool, which is intended to provide decision makers with the data that they need to reduce conflict between large-scale solar energy development and sensitive natural habitats. So it's incorporating data on imperiled species, riparian areas, climate resilience, and it did use the Southeast Blueprint as well to help identify these sensitive environmental areas that we might want to avoid while developing large-scale solar and wind. So this is kind of a focus on Georgia, but as these solar and wind energy developments start to gain momentum across the whole Southeast. I think that this approach can serve as a model for other states and regional approaches to kind of deconflict renewable energy and our natural resource conservation efforts. So that's what's coming up in August, same time as today, but we'll be back on the usual connection information, the Teams connection for the CCAS webinar. And if you would like to sign up for the newsletter to get a reminder about this web forum, I will put the link to sign up for the CCAS newsletter in the chat. And then I believe the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center staff want to provide an update on their upcoming symposium.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. And thanks again, Wes, for a really good presentation. So yeah, from the Southeast CASC perspective, I wanted to call your attention to our upcoming Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Symposium, which is being held in person in Gulf Shores, Alabama on September 19th to the 21st. You can see there. So we are currently accepting abstracts for a poster tool, poster presentation, tools demonstration, networking session that I'd encourage you to consider submitting something for. Those actually are due fairly soon, though we could, if you let me know if you're interested and you can't make that deadline of next Monday, July 25th, please be in touch and we can see what we can do about that. But this is just a unique opportunity for climate and other researchers and resource managers to really come together to learn from each other and help share information, consider science needs, et cetera. So would definitely encourage you to consider coming. And if travel support is an issue, please also contact me, especially if you're with a state agency. We really would love to have your participation, and we're trying to cover, help folks get there as if that's a challenge for them. So yeah, we'll also throw the link into the chat to sign up for the Southeast CASC newsletter if you need another one of those in your inbox. And but that also helps you learn more about these about these events and other upcoming webinars. So with that, I will just thank everyone for joining us today again. Also thank Wes again for a really good presentation, and encourage you all to enjoy the rest of your day. So thanks.
Thanks so much for tuning in.
Bye.